on any given day at Ramp, our research calendar is full of product designers, product managers, product marketers, product operations people running customer interviews. And within 15 minutes of wrapping an interview, the person who ran it gets this, a coaching scorecard in their Slack DMs. This isn't a debrief that might get scheduled later. This isn't a generic tip sheet. This isn't me following up with them a few weeks later. Hey, how'd it go? This is specific, grounded, transcript-focused feedback on how they conducted that interview, what they did well, what they didn't, and exactly what they should do differently next time. So this talk is about how that exists and what we're learning as we run this kind of coaching experiment at scale. So to understand why this matters, I'll give you a little bit of context about how democratized research works at Ramp. So Ramp is a hyperscaling B2B fintech offering corporate cards, expense management, bill payments, procurement, treasury, and by the time I finish this sentence, probably some other feature that the team is working on right now. Our corporate culture is velocity, and they really mean it. But our UXR team is only 3 people. We are 3. And we support over 90 builders in design, product, and marketing, running customer interviews at all stages of our build process every day. Now, for a lot of people, like democratization kind of happened a little bit later. This model, democratized, decentralized, was always the way research worked at Ramp. The UXR team operates primarily as an enablement engine, not a service desk, not an embedded model where researchers are the only people doing research. In our case, democratization wasn't an aspiration or a demand to sort of change our team shape and how we functioned. Democratization is our default in most cases. And for a long time, that meant that we had some visibility into what research and interviews was happening, but we had nearly no visibility into the quality of those interviews. Ramp moves really quickly. New people are joining all the time, and they're hired because they're super capable in their domains and they're high agency, right, in how they operate. So a typical first week has people getting on customer calls and shipping something to production. That is completely normal. So in that context, UXR was giving people tools and templates and recruitment support and assumed they were competent and just let people go. And we had about 200 interviews running every quarter with 0 feedback loop, 0 visibility there. Not because we didn't care, but it was just like, how do you get this? Like, how would we even do this differently? Like, trying to examine quality and provide coaching at that scale just seemed completely impossible until it wasn't. So back in February, my manager asked me to deliver a training to designers at a team day that we had at a company offsite. The topic that she wanted was how to do better prototype testing interviews. But the timing was next week. So I had to completely scramble. So to prepare, I did what most researchers would do, right? I gathered data and I assembled data. So I put together some points of view about what I thought good prototype testing looked like from my experience, some book content, some Perplexity desk research, and my observations about Ramp's ways of working and tools. I threw that data together in Notion, the content management system, and I used Notion AI to synthesize all of that into a set of best practices. And then I thought, are the designers at Ramp actually doing this stuff already? Because I didn't know, right? I hadn't actually sat in their interviews. I really didn't know. So I thought, I don't want to look like an idiot. I don't want to waste time telling them things that they already know. So I took that initial set of best practices, and then I asked Notion AI to check a few customer interview transcripts that we had in our call database in Notion to see if it could tell if these were practices that the designers were already following. Because if they were, I was just like, great, you're doing good on this, and I would skip it and I would focus on something else. So I asked Notion AI to put these things together. Are designers already doing this? It turns out they weren't. There was a real gap between the best practices and just the few sample of transcripts that I pulled. But as I was sitting with those transcripts, something else kind of happened. I started to see a pattern, not in just like what was missing in the transcripts, but how consistent certain things were missing. And I had this kind of moment of inspiration. What if I didn't just check the transcripts in order to deliver the training? What if I built a system to deliver training for me? And so I did. Within a couple of hours, I had built a coaching system in Notion that I genuinely had not even thought about building when I opened up my laptop that morning. It was me, it was Notion AI, and it was our call database. And suddenly I had a system that could score an interview transcript against a rubric and tell the person who ran it how they did and how to get better. So I want to be honest about how that felt. It wasn't just exciting, it was actually kind of unsettling, like how easy it was to do. Like, I've been in research long enough. I have a long list of things that I would have loved to have built at various points that could have increased our impact, but they never got built, not because they weren't valuable, but because we couldn't build these things ourselves, right? So it was something that was gonna go in some data person's backlog, it was gonna sit there for months, and it was never gonna get built. But here I was, having built this really specific UXR tool I never even dreamed of in an afternoon without needing anyone to help me do it. So AI helped me see this opportunity, the pattern in these transcripts, but it gave me the power to build this solution. You know, if you're working in a democratized research environment, that is like such a powerful shift. It didn't just give me a new tool, it gave me the power to build something that we needed that just literally had not been possible before. So let me show you what the coach actually is. So this coach system was built on UXR infrastructure that we already had. So the first thing that we have here is the interview getting recorded. That's happening in Rally or Zoom here. The transcript is syncing automatically to our call database in Notion via the Rally API. That automation had already been set up by engineers, so like that was already happening. But from there, my system kicks in with a session sync agent. It links that call to the right moderator and their role, and then it adds that to the coach database. And that kicks in down here with the interview coach agent. So the coach agent is reading the full transcript. It's identifying what type of interview this was. It's scoring using 7 dimensions, which I'm going to get into, against this rubric. And it writes coaching. And then the output goes in 2 places. It goes in that Slack DM, which I shared with you earlier, and then a full interview scorecard as a Notion page that has all the evidence there. Then on the 3rd row down here is the benchmark agent. So every quarter, each person is getting a report card that has all of their coaching for the quarter, so they can see trends, they can see focus areas. We're giving them targeted curriculum suggestions here, and then some call examples. So this whole thing is running on Notion's custom agents feature. We're using Claude Opus sort of under the hood as our model there. So it wasn't just, to make this possible, it wasn't just a new AI tool, it was really the infrastructure that we already had, that reliable call database. We had transcripts coming in via API, but we also had a culture that was really encouraging building and giving us these tools and saying, go for it, figure it out. So what are we actually doing in this scoring rubric? What does this look like? So there are 7 dimensions that make up the rubric that the coach uses to evaluate performance. And each of these dimensions is getting a score from needs care to developing to strong. And I really wanted like a growth metaphor here. I didn't want people to feel like they were really being graded or judged, but just to acknowledge, you didn't train to do this. You were learning how to do this on the job, and our job is to make you good at what you're doing. And so that was really important to me, that people feel, sort of not judged, but really like growth mindset here. So let's go through the rubric here. So the first thing we have here is session setup. Some of these, if you're a researcher, these are going to sound so basic. You're going to be like, really? People needed to be told this? But actually, people did need to be told this. So did you explain to the participant what this interview is for? Did you set expectations for the session? Did you get informed consent? Really, the basics there. Focus and learning discipline is about staying on your research questions. Did you go into this call really having clear learning objectives, and did you stick to them? Did you actually meet them, or did you just kind of follow the customer, sort of chase interesting tangents there? Then we have context before concept. Did you take the time to understand the participant's world and their workflow and their pain points before you showed them the thing that you were excited about building? This is one of the most common mistakes we see, just jumping right to, hey, I got a prototype. Then I want to show you, here's what we built. So again, sounds simple, but it's so important to help people understand, to gather that context. Then researchers will know and love this one, neutrality and bias control. Were you asking open questions or closed questions? Were they leading? Were you doing things that are going to lead to confirmation bias? Were you embedding the answer that you wanted to hear into how you frame the question? This is really classic and really an important area for so many people who do research the first times they start learning here. Then we have observation over explanation. Did you watch them use the thing, or did you demo it for them? This is another one that we see all the time. This is really the difference between, say, a usability test and a product demo or a product walkthrough. Then we have question quality and depth. Did you probe deeper when something interesting came up, or did you accept the first answer and just move on? So, a really good interview, digs down, probes a little bit more deeply while you're continuing the conversation. And finally, this workflow integration. Are you really grounding the conversation in their real workflows, their real decisions, their real tools, or did you keep it very abstract and actually not ask to see anything and just sort of accept a 2-minute summary of how somebody claims they did something? So these are the 7 dimensions, but not all these dimensions matter equally in all different contexts. So if we look at sort of what does this sound like, what is this rubric in practice? So if we look at session setup, a strong session setup here means you're sharing a clear agenda, you're giving some time estimates, you're explaining why you're even having this conversation, you're clarifying the participant's role here, and you're making sure you're getting recording consent. The participant really knows what to accept. Developing would be vague. There's not much structure here. The participant doesn't really know how long each section is going to take. Are you going to be showing me something? Am I going to be telling you something and sharing my screen? So that's a bit vague. Needs care would be jumping straight into questions with no framing at all, no explaining who you are, why this conversation is happening, no agenda, no consent, not respecting the participant's time by showing up late or running over. That obviously damages RAM's reputation, disrespects the participant's time, so that's a big flag there. Context before concept is kind of similar here. So strong means you're spending 10 to 15 minutes really understanding the participant's world before you start showing them anything. Developing is brief. You're asking a context question, but you're moving on, after 2 minutes. And needs care, again, you're jumping straight to a prototype. Glad we have you here, let me show you something. And you're getting no grounding and no real understanding of what the person's actual workflow is like. So the rubric has this level of detail, more, for all 7 dimensions, and each score is coming with a coaching script. So this is specific, direct, actionable feedback that the coach is writing based on what it actually found in the transcript. So let me show you what an example session scorecard actually looks like here. So this I developed and anonymized from an interview that happened a couple of weeks ago. And you can see here, this was coded as a discovery type of interview. Though as we look at it, I don't think that was actually the intention for the session. So we can see the overall assessment here is developing. So someone who just scans it, how did I do? Why am I developing? We can see that's why it is. So you got good, candid customer context, which was great, but you lost the thread early, and this kind of evolved into a support call, which wasn't your intention when you went into this. You didn't do too much of probing of the underlying workflows and the decision criteria here. You said you were going to show a prototype, but you never did. And ouch. So all of the heavy dimensions for discovery here scored pretty developing. You got some useful data, but it was shallow. You didn't really probe as deeply as you could have here. So if we scroll then through each of the dimension scores, it explains why you got a developing for each of these things here. And in this case, this wasn't developing for everything. So we can see You were developing, you've got your evidence for some of these dimensions here. You got a strong here for your neutrality and bias control. It's actually a big deal for designers. That doesn't happen as often as we would like to see it. There weren't leading questions. You didn't defend any design choices here. You stayed open. Participant talk time was good. So that was great. So you can kind of scroll through and see what each of the issues were here. And then we get down to the bottom here. We've got your priority coaching focus areas. So in this case, for question quality in depth, what happened here is that the feedback from the customer was kind of deflected. So we were getting really kind of candid feedback from this customer, but what happened was, I'll take that back to the team. They missed an opportunity to say, hey, wait, tell me more about that. What was the impact of this thing going wrong for you on your organization? And that comes up in the try next time. So folks can see, okay, when I did this, take this back to the team is kind of okay, but it puts me in a support role in that case, and that's not really what you want in a UXR session. So next time, do one probe before acknowledging that you're going to follow up. Walk me through what happened when you noticed this didn't work right. So that's the kind of coaching that comes up, but we also want to point out what you did well here too. Like, you had really good rapport. You really did stay neutral. You requested screen sharing. Again, lots of folks aren't doing this in these moments when you're trying to understand somebody's actual workflow. So in this case, this person is getting coaching, but also you're doing these things well. Keep doing them. And what's really important to me is that this feedback is landing 15 minutes after the interview ends. So I just want to dwell on that for a second. So this is 15 minutes. This is not waiting for a debrief with the research team that might not get scheduled. There's also no softening of feedback here because a manager or a UXR team member doesn't want an awkward conversation with the person who did the interview. So the coaching really is quite direct in a way that human feedback often isn't, right? Because we're humans and social desirability and all of those things. Like, literally one of the rubric dimensions includes the instructions, this is non-negotiable. So if that happens in a session, the feedback that comes back to the person is like, that was critical, that you didn't do this, and this is what you need to do next time. But this is arriving at exactly the moment when the interview is still fresh in somebody's mind because they just did it, right? And this wasn't a feature that I designed intentionally. It was just kind of when the data came in, it gets processed and then it goes out. But it turns out this timeliness is one of the things that really makes it work for people. So, sounds great, but it broke, right? So I started with the basic interview types that I knew designers were doing: discovery, generative prototype testing, evaluative prototype testing. That's what the training was going to be for designers, that I had built the rubric sort of around these three types. I wasn't really sure how well it was going to generalize beyond designers, so I tried expanding it with a few new joiners in product, and that's when it got interesting and got a little broken. So one of our product managers, Alex, reached out to me. He had been getting some scores coming through. He was kind of curious about the system, and he asked, I've got a call coming up in 15 minutes. Do you think the coach can handle scoring it? Can we try it? And I said, sure. I don't know what's going to happen, but sure. So he ran his interview. I pointed the coach at that interview, and it came back with a response I wasn't really expecting. It said, this isn't a UXR interview. It doesn't fit any of the interview types that you have in the framework. It's post-launch product feedback. I can't score it. And I went, oh, okay. And Alex said, I think that was actually a really good call, probably one of the best ones I've had in a while. Is there something that we can do here? And that friction was really productive because it forced the right question. What does good look like for a live product feedback call? Because product managers do that all the time. So the coach needed a new lens to accommodate the types of interviews that folks outside of design were doing. So each of these types of interviews has a different purpose, and that purpose changes what good looks like. So with a discovery kind of interview that product people or designers might be doing, the question is really, what problem should we solve? Usually people aren't showing a prototype. This is really about, exploring the problem space here. With a generative prototype test, that's more like what would or could solving this look like? So the prototype is there as a stimulus. We're exploring mental models and just using that as a way to like bounce ideas. When we get down to evaluative prototype testing, that's we're a little bit more committed. At that point, does this solution actually work? So when we have a prototype, we're looking to see, can people actually complete the tasks that we think they should be able to complete with this thing? But this live product feedback area here didn't exist when I started out with a coach. And Alex's call really forced me to build this. So this is covering things like alpha testing, beta testing, feedback when a feature is in general availability, NPS detractor interviews, all of that kind of stuff. So different dimensions are critical at each of these points. So Alex's call really broke the system because it didn't fit any of these first three types. Once we added this fourth type, we had to then start thinking about changing the weighting. All of these dimensions need to be weighted a little bit differently for these different types of interviews. So we ran Alex's call through this updated rubric. It was all strong. Alex was thrilled. I'm retiring from UXR calls. I peaked. Like, there's nowhere else I can go here. Fine. So really, every time the system kind of broke, it got a little bit smarter. And this is kind of how the SMART actually works for this system. So this is context-weighted scoring for each of these dimensions. So we went through these 7 dimensions here already, but for each of these types of interviews, the weighting is a bit different. So rather than having a generic kind of prompt that says, score this interview on research quality, the rubric looks and contextually weights the behavior, and it gets scored differently depending on the interview type. So if we looked at like observation over explanation, for example, in an evaluative prototype test, this one is critical. So if you're explaining anything to the participant during an evaluative test about how that prototype works, that is a critical failure because you're masking usability issues because you're not actually letting somebody try it, right? But in a generative test, some amount of explanation is okay as long as you've observed some natural behavior first. So it's the same behavior, but it's a totally different weight depending on the purpose of the interview. When we look at something like workflow integration in a live product feedback session, that one is critical. If you're not grounding the conversation in how somebody actually uses the product, you are completely missing so much of the nuance and so much of the value of what you can learn here. So the overall assessment is following the heavy dimensions, but any failure on a critical dimension is going to override everything else. So it doesn't matter how many other things about this were strong that you got elsewhere. If you're violating a critical principle there, the overall assessment is going to reflect that. So this level of nuance took time, it took craft experience, and it took some cultural understanding to build. This is kind of beyond ops and process. You have to know what a good interview sounds like to encode it in a rubric. So if you are in research ops, this is why developing your own craft fluency is actually really important, and it can really matter, not because you're going to become a researcher and run every interview yourself, but because you need to know what good looks like to build a system that can evaluate it. So once we started scoring all the UX interviews that were happening across our organization, something started to shift for us. We stopped guessing about democratized research quality, and we started knowing where to invest our coaching efforts. So I want to be upfront about something. When I built the coach, I had no success metrics for it beyond, can I build a system that's going to deliver consistent and rigorous and asynchronous coaching to people who do research? So yay, I did it, success. But actually examining whether and how it's making people who do research measurably better at research is more complicated. I can tell you what the data is showing me and what I'm doing with it. So I mentioned before, every person who's doing research at RAMP gets this quarterly report card. So it's showing their individual performance across all their interviews over that quarter, the types of interviews they've run, things that they're consistently strong at, things that they consistently need to develop, and their score history over time. They can see how they're trending, as can the UXR team, and in some cases, these people's managers. But when I zoom out across all 90 plus people who are doing research, some patterns emerge, but interpreting them is genuinely complicated, right? The cohorts of people who are in coaching shift, the interview types change, new people join, other people are leaving. The data is really noisy, but some signals are cutting through here. So one is designers. So designers were consistently scoring lower than the other roles in coaching, and consistently on 3 specific dimensions, which we're going to get into in a moment. Those patterns were really holding across interview types and across the quarter. So that is what I built the offsite training around. So for designers, the 3 dimensions where they were really struggling were neutrality, observation, and question depth. Consistently the lowest scoring here. So what I did with the offsite training wasn't just generic, here are all the things that you need to be doing differently. I really focused on these specific dimensions and the actual patterns from the transcripts the coach had flagged repeatedly. So leading questions, demoing instead of observing, and really accepting surface level answers without probing deeper. So at the training, each person got their first report card as a benchmark, so they could see their own transcript examples alongside the coach's advice. That made it really personal for them, not theoretical. And again, it was really framed around growth. Like, this is why we're here. This is why we're having this training and having these conversations. We ended the training with UXR Bingo. If you've never done UXR Bingo, highly recommend. It helped designers spot the patterns on a mock interview that UXR did. So we made ourselves look like complete idiots and did this training. And the bingo card was literally the patterns, the strong ones and the weaker ones. And of course, people loved it. People won prizes. But what made me so happy coming out of that training was particularly the junior designers who were like, I have never had to do UXR interviews before. It's my first job out of college. And I was suddenly, put in these, positions of this is the thing that I had to do. And I didn't really know how to do it, but I'm learning by doing, but I can see now what I'm doing wrong, but now I know what to change, because that wasn't really clear to them before. So how did this land with people being coached? So the designers were pretty happy with it. When I expanded the coach beyond designers, though, I was like, don't quite know how this is going to go. So I announced it in the right Slack channels. I opted everybody in. Of course, as we were talking about, people don't read. So like, you did what? We have a what? So for most people who do research at RAMP, the first time they even heard about the coach or encountered the coach was 15 minutes after they conducted an interview. They got a Slack notification they weren't expecting. They got tough but fair feedback they hadn't asked for, and the response was not quite what I feared. It was, oh wow, this is so cool. So one of our product marketing directors messaged me out of nowhere. She was like, I love this. I agree with this feedback. Like, I felt like at the end, I was giving my interpretation. I was summarizing things for the customer, and instead of like letting her tell me, letting her words come through, she had really identified exactly what she'd done and why it mattered. And a few weeks later, she came back to me and said, how did you build this? Because she wanted to build something similar to evaluate product marketing pitches. So the coaching system had kind of shown her like what something like this could look like. And she was like, oh, I could apply this to like my space. I want this for what my team does. Alex, who we had talked about before, one of our product managers, had a similar experience. So after we got the rubric right for his calls, he said, now I'm finding myself thinking through how to phrase questions as I'm preparing to ask them. How can I ask this in an unbiased and an open-ended way? And Chris, one of our junior designers, messaged me when he got his first All Strong scorecard. I finally got trees. I just it's just the sweetest thing. Watching him move to developing to strong. And fun fact, he recently got promoted. And one of the reasons he got promoted was all the UXR calls that he had done, all of the things that he had learned about customers through doing this. And just yesterday, he was evangelizing better UXR practices to our whole design team. They don't listen to us, but they listen to him because he just got promoted and he does what they do. So this, I love it. I have a lot of stories of appreciation and, low-key addiction from like some of the like very keen, academic folks who are like, I want to make sure that I'm getting strongs. But there's really this magic moment of like receiving their first scorecard there. But I have to be honest, engagement varies, right? Like any coaching environment. The system can't manufacture motivation for people who don't already have it, right? But for people who already have the motivation, the coaching is there to help them improve. So we've run this, kind of coaching experiment for a couple quarters now, 200 plus interviews per quarter, getting coaching, previously didn't get any. I need to be honest about like what the data is and isn't telling me. So it is not telling me a very clear up and to the right, everybody's getting better at research as a result of this thing. As I said, the cohorts are shifting. We expanded coaching to more roles. The mix of interview types are changing. New people are joining, others are leaving. There are a lot of variables to attribute movement in scores to coaching alone. But what the data does tell us is where to invest, which roles, which interview types, which specific individuals. So designers, again, consistently scoring lower than some of our other roles on the same dimensions every quarter. So that's not noise. That's a signal. That's why I built that offsite training the way that I did. And it's also guiding us into what we need to build into our systems for starting and running research projects, right? What are the quality guardrails that we need to build into that system when we're helping people draft a discussion guide? How can we make sure that that discussion guide is also going to help them score better through their coaching? So what we have now that we didn't have before is a picture of who's running what and how they're doing. Whether the coach is going to change how people conduct research, it is for some people, not yet for everybody. But this is, still very experimental. We're not there yet, with everybody being strong, but we're finally in a position to be able to ask how to improve and where we should focus and where we should, help people grow. So, craft coaching does not scale. That was true for a long time, and it shaped how we thought about democratized research. We could give people templates. We could give them tools. We could run the occasional training, but the ongoing specific session-by-session coaching that actually changes how somebody conducts an interview, that was really only possible for the few people that a researcher had time to sit in with. Our team just does not work like that. So what I've built at Ramp here isn't magic, but craft coaching can scale now. But it requires the craft knowledge, it requires the infrastructure, it requires the culture, some inspiration from you, and obviously AI, right? So you've got to have the craft knowledge. You need to know what good research looks like across these different interview types. You have to already have the infrastructure, right? You have to have a call database. You have to have accessible transcripts. You do have to have the right tools. It also required a culture that encouraged the building, the tinkering, the trying something, the token usage, letting it break, building it better. We happen to have that culture. But AI didn't replace any work that we were already doing here. Like that for me was so key. It let me do things I could not have done without it. So if you're working in a democratized research environment, increasingly many of us are, like the question isn't whether your people who do research need coaching. They do. The question is what your version of that could look like and whether the kind of moment and opportunity and inspiration for you to figure that out becomes a moment where you can actually build what you need. Like my inspiration was very accidental. Came on a Friday afternoon when I was scrambling to prepare this training that I didn't have time for. That was my moment. I hope that you find yours too.